She was asked to play a simple waltz for the Duke. Then her extraordinary performance left the entire hall amazed. There is a moment, most people have experienced it at least once in their lives, when someone walks into a room and the whole room changes. Not because the person is loud, not because they are dressed impressively, not because they demand attention, but because something about them is so completely real, so completely themselves, that the air in the room seems to shift a little. Something settles, something pays attention. This is a story about one of those moments. It happened in Vienna, in the autumn of 1872, inside a grand hall where powerful people had gathered to eat, drink, and impress one another. And the person who walked in and changed everything was a young woman who had been brought there to be the background. Not a guest, not a performer, just background music, something pleasant to fill the silences between conversations, something easily ignored. Nobody expected what happened next. Not the Duke, not the generals and ministers and fine ladies standing around with their glasses of wine. Not even, perhaps, the young woman herself, though if you had asked her about it afterward, she would have simply smiled and said she had only done what she always did. She played the way she knew how to play. That was all. But that was everything. Her name was Elise, and she grew up in one of the older, quieter parts of Vienna, a neighborhood that was full of life, but not the kind of life the newspapers wrote about. There were no grand boulevards there, no carriages with crests painted on their doors, no ladies in silk gloves stepping out of concert halls. What there was, instead, was the smell of bread from the bakery on the corner, the sound of children playing in the courtyard, old men arguing cheerfully about nothing on the steps of the small church, and the constant, comforting tick of her father's clocks. Her father was a clockmaker, a good one of the best in that part of the city, though he would never have said so himself. He was a quiet, careful man who believed that if you did your work honestly and with full attention, that was enough. He had spent 30 years repairing and building timepieces for the families of tradesmen, small shopkeepers, teachers, and the occasional wealthier customer who had found their way to his little shop on a side street. His hands were steady and precise. His workshop smelled of oil and metal and the faint, sweet scent of wood shavings. It was the place where Elise had spent most of her childhood, sitting on a stool beside his workbench, watching him work, listening to the overlapping ticking and chiming of a dozen clocks at once. People who knew her as a child would later say that she had always been different. Not in a dramatic way, not in the way of someone who was always performing or always trying to stand out, more in the way that some children simply notice more than others. She noticed patterns. She noticed repetitions. She noticed when something was slightly off rhythm, slightly out of place. Her father's clocks taught her that, probably. When you grow up surrounded by mechanisms that depend entirely on exact timing, you develop an ear for it. Music found her early, and she found it back just as quickly. They took to each other like old friends who had simply been in different rooms for a few years. She did not have early lessons, not at first. There was no money for a teacher, and the schools that taught music properly were not the kind of schools her family had access to. What she had instead was a neighbor, a retired woman named Frau Lotte, who lived 2 floors above them and had once, many years ago, been a capable amateur pianist. Frau Lotte had an old upright piano that she no longer played, and one afternoon she invited young Elise up to look at it, mostly out of kindness, mostly because the girl had asked so politely. Elise sat down on the bench, looked at the keys for a long moment, and then, having never been taught a single note, played back note for note a short melody she had heard a street musician performing earlier that day. Frau Lotte stood very still in the doorway of her parlor for a full minute. Then she sat down on the old armchair in the corner, folded her hands in her lap, and said quietly, "Well, we had better start properly then." And so they did. Frau Lotte was not a teacher by profession, and she would have been the first to tell you that her own playing had grown rusty over the years. But she knew the fundamentals. She knew how to teach a child to read music, how to explain technique, how to give a young musician the tools they needed to grow. And Elise grew fast, faster than Frau Lotte had expected, faster probably than anyone had expected. What should have taken a careful student 2 years to learn, Elise absorbed in 6 months. What should have taken 5 years she had done in 2. By the time she was 12, she had quietly outgrown everything her neighbor could teach her. Frau Lotte was honest about it. She sat Elise down one afternoon and told her plainly, "You have gone past what I know. I cannot teach you any more. But I want you to understand something." She leaned forward a little. "What you have is not common. I have seen a lot of people play piano in my life. I have played myself, badly and sometimes less badly, for 40 years, and I have never heard anyone your age play the way you play. You have something real inside you. Don't let anyone talk you out of it." Elise was 12. She nodded seriously, the way 12-year-olds do when they are trying to look grown up. But she kept those words somewhere safe inside her, and she would need them later. Growing up is, among other things, the slow and sometimes painful process of learning how the world sees you. Not how you see yourself, how the world sees you. And Vienna in the 1870s had very specific ideas about who was allowed to do what, and where, and how. Elise was the daughter of a Jewish clockmaker. She was not wealthy. She was not from a family with a name anyone recognized. She had not been educated at the right schools or introduced to the right people. She had not had the lessons that the daughters of middle-class families received, the careful, structured training at proper conservatories where connections were built and reputations began. She had learned on a neighbor's old piano, in a small apartment 2 floors above her father's workshop, in a neighborhood that the city's finer residents would not have been able to find on a map. This mattered. It mattered in ways that were sometimes spoken aloud and sometimes simply understood, silently, through closed doors and unreturned letters and positions that were quietly given to someone else. She applied, at 17, to a well-regarded music school. She prepared carefully. She played beautifully at the audition. She knew this herself, and the panel knew it too. She could see it in their faces. And still the letter that came back was a polite refusal. No reason given. No invitation to try again. She applied to another school. Another refusal. She applied for a position accompanying a choir at a church in a wealthier district. The choir master met with her once, seemed genuinely impressed, and then wrote to say he had found someone else. She learned, after a while, to stop expecting fairness, not to become bitter about it. Bitterness was expensive, and she had other things to spend her energy on, but simply to accept that certain doors had locks she could not pick, and to look instead for the doors that were actually open. What was open to her was this: the music school on Varinger Strasse, in her own neighborhood, which taught children of ordinary families, the sons and daughters of tradesmen and shopkeepers and workers, the basics of music. It was a good school in its own modest way. It was not prestigious. Nobody there was going to end up performing at the great concert hall on Bosendorfer Strasse. But the children were willing, and sometimes genuinely talented, and Elise found that she liked teaching. She liked the moment when something clicked for a student, when they stopped fighting with the instrument and started actually listening to it. That moment was the same, she thought, regardless of which door you had come through to get here. She taught there 5 days a week. On weekends she sometimes played at neighborhood gatherings, at small celebrations, at the occasional wedding or birthday. She was paid modestly, and she managed, and her father never complained about the rent, though she sometimes noticed him counting carefully in the evenings. She was 22 years old, and she sometimes thought late at night when the apartment was quiet, resigned herself to a particular kind of life. A good life. A real life. A life with music in it, which was more than many people had. She told herself this often. Usually she believed it. She had not, though, and this is important, she had not stopped playing for herself. No matter how tired she was at the end of a teaching day, she sat at the old upright piano that had been moved to their apartment after Frau Lotte passed away, and she played. Not pieces she was preparing for lessons, not simple exercises. She played the things she loved, complex, demanding pieces that she had taught herself from scores she borrowed from the library, pieces that were far beyond anything her students would encounter for years. She played them in the evenings, alone, with the window sometimes slightly open so the music drifted out into the courtyard, and the neighbors learned to stop what they were doing and simply listen. That was who Elise was, before the letter arrived. A young woman of real and unusual talent, who had learned to live inside a world that mostly did not see it, who had learned to find joy in the work she was given rather than the work she had imagined, who was, in her own quiet way, extraordinary, and who had almost stopped expecting anyone to notice. The letter came on a Thursday. It was delivered to the music school rather than her home, which was the first strange thing about it, and it was sealed with dark blue wax pressed with a crest she did not immediately recognize. Herr Brandt, the school's director, brought it to her personally between lessons, holding it out with both hands as though it might be fragile or possibly dangerous. She turned it over and looked at the seal carefully. Then she broke it and read. It was from the household of Duke Friedrich von Albrecht. She had heard the name. Most people in Vienna had heard the name. He was not simply wealthy. There were many wealthy people in Vienna, and most of them were unremarkable. The Duke was something else, a man of real cultural influence, someone who shaped what the city thought of as artistic and important, someone whose opinion genuinely mattered to the people whose opinions mattered to everyone else. He collected paintings and supported sculptors, and funded a small but respected chamber music society. He was known for having extremely high standards, and almost no patience for anyone who fell short of them. The letter was short and very formal. It explained that the Duke was hosting a private evening gathering 3 days from now. His regular pianist had fallen ill quite suddenly, through what the letter called a chain of recommendations, which Elise later learned meant a friend of a colleague of a footman. Her name had been put forward. She was invited to attend and to perform a program of light pieces during the evening, waltzes, perhaps a nocturne, something suitable for background entertainment, while the guests conversed. Background entertainment. She read those two words twice. The fee offered was at the bottom of the letter, in precise, small numbers. She looked at it for a moment. It was enough to cover 3 months of their rent. Her father's accounts had been tight lately. 2 of his regular customers had moved away and had not been replaced. 3 months of rent, for 1 evening's work. She folded the letter and put it in her coat pocket. She finished her afternoon lessons. She walked home through the streets she had walked 10,000 times, nodding to the baker, stepping around the puddle near the corner of Taborstrasse, pausing to let an old man and his dog cross in front of her. She let herself into the apartment and sat for a moment at the piano without playing. Then she went to her father's workshop and told him about the letter. He listened without speaking, the way he always listened, completely still, his hands quiet on the workbench, his eyes on her face. When she finished, he was silent for another moment. Then he said, "Will you go?" "Yes," she said. "Of course. The money is—" "I know about the money," he said gently. "Will you go for another reason as well?" She looked at him. He was looking back at her with the steady, unhurried attention he gave to everything that mattered to him. She thought about it honestly. "Yes," she said. "I think so." He nodded once, slowly, and picked up his tools again. She had 3 days to prepare. The piece they wanted was a Strauss waltz, a famous one, cheerful and beautifully constructed, the kind of piece that every pianist who had been playing for more than a few years knew by heart. She had played it dozens of times. For lessons, for neighborhood gatherings, for the occasional formal occasion. She could have played it in her sleep. On the first day, she played it exactly as written, perfectly, carefully, exactly the way Johann Strauss had intended it. She ran through it 3 times from beginning to end, and it was lovely. It was completely correct. It was, she thought, exactly what they would expect from a background pianist hired on short notice. Lovely, correct, completely forgettable. She sat at the piano for a long time after those 3 run-throughs, her hands in her lap, looking at the keys. She was not by nature a rule-breaker. She was not the kind of person who made scenes or sought conflict. She had spent most of her adult life learning to work within the limits of what she was given, and she had found a kind of quiet peace in that. But there was something sitting in her chest right now that she did not quite have a word for. Not rebellion exactly, not even ambition, something more like honesty, something that said, if you go to that house and you play what they expect, you will be giving them less than you have to give. And you know it, and you will know it. She had been asked to be background music. She understood that. She was not going to march in and announce herself as an artist and insist on being treated as one. That was not who she was, and it would also have been, practically speaking, a very poor idea. But she thought carefully about this. There was a difference between playing the waltz as they expected and playing the waltz as honestly as she could. She could do both things at once. She was certain of it. On the second day she began to work. She started with the melody itself, not changing it, not rewriting it, just listening to it differently, listening to what it was trying to do, what it wanted to feel like, and then asking herself, what would it feel like if she let it be as fully itself as possible? What would it feel like if every note meant exactly what it could mean? She began to make small changes, a shift in the phrasing here, letting a line breathe a half beat longer than the sheet music suggested, a harmonic variation in the middle section, nothing dramatic, nothing that would make a listener think that's wrong, but something that opened the music slightly, like opening a window in a warm room. The melody remained recognizable, the structure remained intact, but something inside it had changed, something had woken up. On the third day she played it from beginning to end and sat back and listened to what she had done. It was still the waltz. A person who knew the piece well would have recognized it immediately, but it was no longer quite what it had been on the first day. It was more serious now, somehow, not in a heavy way, not in a way that would interrupt a conversation or demand attention, but in the way that a painting can be beautiful and pleasant to look at, and also, if you look at it long enough, be about something real. The waltz had always been charming. Now it was also true. Her father came to stand in the doorway of the parlor near the end of the third day's practice. He stood there for a long time without saying anything. She did not stop playing. She played the piece all the way through to the end, and when the last note faded she looked up and saw his face. He was crying. Not dramatically. Her father never did anything dramatically. Just quietly, the way he sometimes did when something moved him more than he had planned for. He looked at her for a moment, then nodded once, and walked back to his workshop. She sat at the piano for another minute, breathing slowly. Then she closed the sheet music, put it away, and went to bed. On the evening itself she dressed simply. She did not have anything elaborate to wear and had decided that simplicity was better than trying to approximate grandeur. She wore a dark blue dress that she had owned for 3 years, neat and plain, and she put her hair up in the way she always did when she was playing somewhere formal. She looked at herself in the small mirror above the washstand for a moment. Then she picked up her coat and left. The Duke's house, his palais, though she could not quite make herself call it that in her own head, was on one of the most important streets in the city. She had walked past that street before, but had never had occasion to turn down it. It was a different world just on the other side of that corner. The buildings were enormous, pale-colored, heavy with carved stone and symmetry. The street was quiet in the way that only money can make a street quiet. No market stalls, no cooking smells, no neighbors calling to each other out of windows. Just the sound of her own footsteps on the pavement and the distant sound of carriage wheels. She found the entrance she had been directed to, not the main entrance, which had broad stone steps leading up to tall doors and a lantern above them, but a smaller side door, more practical, the kind of door that servants and deliveries used. A young footman let her in and led her through a corridor that was warm and slightly too bright, and then into a small room off the main hall where she was told to wait. She sat on the edge of a wooden chair and listened to the sounds of the house. Through the walls she could hear voices, the muffled, confident voices of people who were comfortable in a place like this, who had grown up knowing how to be in rooms like this. She could hear the clink of glass, occasional laughter, the particular sound of a gathering that had already settled into its own easy rhythm. A different footman came to fetch her after about 20 minutes. He was polite, professionally blank, and he led her through a set of double doors into the music salon. She had been in fine rooms before, not often, but a few times, enough to know what to expect. And yet this room was something else. The ceiling was high and painted with something complicated, involving clouds and figures she did not stop to identify. The walls were a deep green, the color of a forest in summer, and hung with paintings in heavy frames. There were perhaps 30 people in the room, men in formal black with decorations on their chests, women in pale dresses with their hair elaborately arranged, a few older figures seated near the far windows, several people who stood in small groups speaking in the unhurried way of people who were perfectly aware that whatever they were saying was worth listening to. In the center of the room, positioned slightly to one side so as not to dominate but clearly important, was the piano. A grand piano, its black surface so perfectly polished that the candles in the room were reflected in it. Tiny flames doubled in the wood. It was, Elise thought, the most beautiful instrument she had ever been near. The footman announced her in 7 words. The pianist for the evening, Miss Kaufmann. 1 or 2 people near her glanced over briefly. Most did not. A man near the window caught her eye and gave a small, polite nod that meant nothing and everything. It was the nod you give someone who is there to perform a function. The same nod you give a waiter who has just refilled your glass. Across the room she could see the Duke. Duke Friedrich von Albrecht was a lean man, perhaps in his late 50s, with white hair cut very short, and a face that looked like it had spent a long time deciding to be unimpressed and had never changed its mind. He caught her eye. She was not sure if he was actually looking at her or simply in her direction, and gave the same brief nod as the man by the window. She walked to the piano. She pulled the bench out slightly and sat down. She adjusted the height of the bench with small, quiet movements, the way she always did, the way she had done 10,000 times in rooms of all sizes. She set her hands in her lap for a moment. She breathed. Then she began. For the first 2 minutes nothing changed in the room. This was exactly what she expected. The waltz began as a waltz, warm, familiar, cheerful in the easy way that Strauss always managed. It was the musical equivalent of a pleasant evening, and everyone in the room had heard it before, or something very much like it, and it settled into the background of their awareness, the way such pieces are supposed to. Conversations continued, glasses were lifted and set down. A general near the far wall resumed whatever story he had been telling. 2 women near the window leaned toward each other over something amusing. She played steadily, professionally, giving the piece exactly what it needed, not drawing attention to herself, not announcing herself. She was background music and she knew it, and she played accordingly, except that, underneath the familiar surface of the waltz, she was also doing what she had spent 3 days preparing. The phrasing was slightly different from how most pianists would have played it. The middle section arrived with that small harmonic shift she had worked out on the second day. Nothing dramatic, nothing that made someone think, wait, that's not right, just something. She later found it very hard to explain when people asked her about it. What happened was not a single dramatic moment. It was more gradual than that. It was like the way a room gets dark in the evening. You do not see the darkness arrive. You simply look up at some point and realize that something has changed, and it has been changing for a while without you noticing. The general story slowed down, not stopped, just slowed, the way a story slows when the storyteller himself has lost the thread for a moment. The 2 women by the window turned, almost at the same time, slightly toward the piano. A young officer who had been examining something in his coat pocket became still. One of the older men seated near the wall lifted his head and looked toward the instrument with an expression that Elise would later describe as surprised at himself. It happened person by person, conversation by conversation. The room did not go suddenly silent. It went gradually quiet, the way snow falls, individual flakes, each one almost nothing, and then all at once you realize the ground is covered. By the time she reached the final section of the waltz, the room was entirely still. 30 distinguished, important, powerful people, a foreign minister, a Bohemian duchess, military commanders, architects of the city, women who shaped society without ever holding a title, were standing and sitting in complete silence, all of them facing the piano, all of them not quite knowing how it had happened that they had stopped talking. Their glasses were half raised, their stories were unfinished, their whole attention was on the young woman in the dark blue dress, who was, with complete and utter absorption, filling the room with something that had apparently quietly become impossible to ignore. She was not performing to them. That was the thing that several people commented on afterward, trying to find words for it. She was not putting on a show. She was not conscious of her audience in the way that performers sometimes are. She was simply playing the music, playing it the way she had always played it when she was alone in the apartment with the window slightly open, the way she had played it since she was a child in Frau Lotz's parlor. She was entirely there, in the music, swaying just slightly with the pulse of it, her face still and concentrated and calm. The waltz moved through its final phrase. It slowed, the way a river widens before it reaches the sea. The last notes came, not with a bang or a flourish, just quietly, settling, the final chord ringing out into the green-walled room, and then fading, slowly, into the plaster and the curtains and the polished wood of the piano. Silence, not the brief silence of people gathering themselves to applaud, a longer silence, a silence that meant something was still happening inside the people in the room, something that had not finished yet. Nobody moved. The foreign minister was looking at his hands. The Bohemian Duchess had her head tilted slightly to one side, her expression thoughtful in the way of a person who has just understood something they were not expecting to understand. 4 seconds. 5. Then the foreign minister began to clap, not politely, not in the careful, measured way one applauds something that is technically accomplished but not moving. He clapped the way a person claps when they have been moved, and they know it, and they do not want to pretend otherwise. And then the Duchess clapped, and then the general who had been telling the story, and then it was everyone, a burst of genuine, sudden applause that rolled through the room like something that had been held back and then released all at once. Elise sat at the piano for a moment with her hands in her lap and her eyes down. She was not performing modesty. She was simply back in herself, back in the room, returning from wherever the music had taken her. She looked up and saw the faces, surprised, warm, genuinely touched, and something very quiet happened inside her chest. She became aware, gradually, that the applause had settled and that someone was walking toward her from across the room. She looked up and found that it was the Duke. Duke Friedrich von Albrecht stopped beside the piano. He looked at her for a moment with those careful, unimpressed eyes, except that something in them had shifted. It was not warmth, exactly, more like attention, the same attention he might give to something that had turned out to be more than he thought it was. "That was not what I asked you to play," he said. His voice was quiet, so that only she could hear it above the still settling murmur of the room. She met his eyes. "No," she said. "It was the same piece, but perhaps not played the same way." He looked at her for another moment. Then something happened at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile, but the territory near one. "It was considerably better," he said, "than what I asked for." He turned and walked back to his guests. She watched him go. Around the room, people were beginning to move again, beginning to talk again, but differently now. More quietly, more slowly. Conversations had resumed, but they had the quality of conversations that are being held by people who are still partly somewhere else. A woman approached Elise, one of the older women who had been seated near the wall. She was perhaps 70, with white hair and very direct eyes, and she stood in front of the piano and looked at Elise with the same directness. "Where did you study?" she asked. Elise thought about how to answer this honestly. "I had one teacher as a child," she said. "After that, myself." The woman looked at her for a long moment. "Yourself," she repeated, not doubtfully, just taking it in. Then she nodded once, slowly, and said, "I see," and walked away. Later in the evening, she stayed for the rest of it, because the Duke's steward came to ask her to play again, twice more, and she did. A young man came to stand near the piano while she played. He was perhaps 30, pleasant-faced, and he stood with the easy manner of someone who had grown up in rooms like this. When she finished the piece he was listening to, he introduced himself. His name was Wilhelm. He was the secretary of the Vienna Philharmonic Society. He asked if he could have her card. She did not have a card. She said so plainly. He took a small notebook from his pocket and a pencil, and wrote down her address. The evening ended late. The Duke's footman brought her coat. He was the same one who had shown her to the waiting room at the beginning, but something had changed in the way he looked at her. Not dramatically, just slightly. The particular way a person looks at someone they have silently revised their opinion of, without quite admitting it. She walked home through streets that were quiet now, the city tucking itself away for the night. She walked slowly, not in a hurry. her breath making small clouds in the cold air. The sounds of the evening were still with her, the music, the applause, the Duke's quiet words beside the piano, the foreign minister's face, the old woman's "I see." She stopped on a bridge over the canal for a moment and looked at the water. A few lights were reflected in it, broken and wavering. She stood there for a while, thinking about nothing in particular, feeling the particular feeling of a person who has done something true and knows it and is trying not to make too much of it and also trying not to make too little of it. Then she kept walking. She let herself into the apartment as quietly as she could. But her father was still awake. He was always awake. He slept badly, had done for years, and sometimes sat at his workbench in the middle of the night, not working, just thinking, keeping himself company with the sound of the clocks. He looked up when she came in. "How was it?" he said. She took off her coat and hung it on the hook by the door. She thought about it. "Good," she said. "I think it was good." He looked at her face for a moment, the way he always did, reading it with the attention he gave to everything that mattered to him. Then he nodded and stood up from his bench and went to bed. She sat at the piano for a while longer, in the dark apartment, not playing, just sitting, thinking about what good meant when you used the word to describe something that had been more than good, thinking about whether there was a word for the feeling of being fully yourself in front of a room full of people who had expected something lesser, and watching them realize that lesser was not what they were getting. She did not find the word that night. She was not sure there was one. 2 weeks later, a letter arrived from the Vienna Philharmonic Society. It was from Wilhelm, the young man with the notebook. He wrote that the society was planning a series of benefit concerts in the spring, and that they were looking for a pianist of genuine ability who might be able to perform one of the featured programs. Would she be available to discuss it? She sat with that letter at the kitchen table for a long time. Her father came and stood behind her and read it over her shoulder. She felt his hand on her shoulder for a moment, brief and firm, and then he went back to his workshop. She wrote back the same day. The meeting with the society went well, better than well. The director, a serious man of middle age with small spectacles and an enormous collection of opinions about music, asked her to play for him before they discussed anything else. It was his policy with every new musician he was considering, he said. She played. When she finished, he took off his spectacles and polished them very carefully and put them back on and said, "You will play the spring series." That was not a question. She also received, not long after, an invitation back to the Duke's house, not as background music this time, but as a featured performer for a private concert he was hosting for a small group of guests who were specifically interested in music. The fee was 4 times what she had received for the first evening, and then, perhaps a month after that, a letter arrived that she held in her hands for a very long time before she could open it. It was from Professor Heinrich Gruber, who was perhaps the most respected music teacher in Vienna, a man who had taught students who now held principal chairs in orchestras across Europe, who had been a professor at the city's finest conservatory for 30 years, who gave private lessons only very rarely now, and only to students he considered genuinely exceptional. He had heard about her from 3 separate people who had been at the Duke's gathering. He wrote to say that he was curious, and that if she was willing to meet with him, he would be glad of it. She was willing. She went to his studio, a room in a building near the Ringstrasse, full of books and scores and the smell of old paper and strong coffee, and played for him for 40 minutes while he sat in an armchair and said nothing. When she finished, he sat for another moment. Then he stood up. "I will teach you," he said. "I do not normally take students anymore, but I will teach you." He picked up a score from the pile on his desk and held it out to her. "Start with this. Come back in a fortnight." She looked at the score. It was one of the most demanding pieces in the repertoire, a concerto that professional pianists at the height of their careers hesitated over. She took it from him carefully. "Thank you," she said. He waved her off in the way of someone who does not like fuss. "Don't thank me yet," he said. "We haven't done anything yet. Come back in a fortnight." She came back in a fortnight. She had learned the concerto. He said nothing about this when she played it for him. He simply marked several passages in the score and told her what he wanted changed. She changed them. She came back again, and it went like that for months. the professor finding small things to refine, to deepen, to push further, and Elise pushing, always, further than he expected. He wrote in his private diary at the end of that first year, "The most naturally gifted musician I have encountered in 30 years of teaching. And more than gifted, she understands what music is for. Some players learn technique. She has learned the thing beneath technique. I do not know where it comes from. Perhaps it cannot be learned. Perhaps she simply arrived with it." The spring benefit concert was the first time she performed on a proper stage in front of an audience that had come specifically to listen. The hall held perhaps 400 people. She stood in the wings beforehand and felt something that was not quite nervousness. She was not afraid of the music. She was never afraid of the music, but a kind of heightened awareness, as though the air were thinner there, as though everything were slightly more itself than usual. She walked out onto the stage and sat down at the grand piano that had been placed there, and she looked out at 400 faces in the dim light of the hall, and something in her settled the way it always settled when she was where she was supposed to be. She played for 50 minutes. The audience sat in the same stillness the Duke's gathering had sat in. When she finished, they stood. That had never happened to her before, an audience standing. She sat at the piano for a moment and felt the sound of them washing over her, and then she stood and bowed again, and came back out a third time because they would not stop. A review appeared 2 days later in one of the city's main newspapers. The reviewer wrote that he had attended concerts in Vienna for 20 years, and could say with confidence that what he had heard 2 evenings ago from a Miss Elise Kaufmann was among the most authentic and moving piano performances he had encountered. "She does not play," he wrote, "she speaks, and what she has to say is worth listening to." She read that review 3 times, alone in the apartment, before carefully folding it and putting it in a drawer. Then she went to teach her Saturday morning lessons in the neighborhood, which she had not cancelled and had no intention of cancelling. The children of tradesmen and shopkeepers and workers needed to learn music too, and she had not forgotten where she had started. This is the part of the story that might surprise you, if you are expecting it to end with Elise becoming a different person. She did not become a different person. She became perhaps more fully herself, which is not the same thing. She continued to teach at the school on Varinger Strasse for years, even as her performing career grew and the invitations became more serious and the stages became larger. She reduced her hours there. Eventually, she had to, but she did not leave entirely. She charged the children of ordinary families a fraction of what she charged the wealthy families who were now seeking her out for private lessons. She said, when asked about this, that music had been kept from her in certain ways when she was young, and she saw no reason to pass that on. She remained, in many ways, the person she had always been, careful with money, because she had always had to be, quiet in large social gatherings, because she had always preferred to listen, slightly awkward with the formal rituals of the world she was now moving in, because those rituals had not been designed with her in mind, and she had no interest in pretending otherwise. She made a few good friends among musicians and a smaller number of good friends among the people who listened to music seriously. She stayed in the neighborhood she had grown up in for longer than people expected. Her father came to the Musikverein to hear her play. She had performed there now, the great concert hall, the hall she had walked past as a child and never imagined she would enter through the front doors. He sat in the 3rd row, in the new coat he had bought specifically and worn nowhere else, and he kept his eyes on his hands for much of the concert, which was his way when he was moved. Several people seated near him noticed afterward, in the way you notice things about strangers when something genuine is happening, that the elderly man in the new coat had been crying quietly from the first note to the last. He died 3 years later, peacefully, in the apartment where they had always lived. She sat with him for a long time that last evening, and at some point she went to the piano and played. Not a piece, not anything composed, just music, the way music had always come out of her when she was being most honest. She did not know what she was playing. She played until there was nothing more to say. She performed professionally for nearly 3 decades in all. The arthritis that came to her right hand in her early 50s made the demands of a full concert career too painful to sustain, and she stepped back from the stage gradually, the way the light fades gradually in the evening, not all at once but in degrees, Each degree a kind of letting go. She did not stop teaching. Teaching, if anything, occupied her more fully once the performing had eased. She had by then a reputation as a teacher of extraordinary ability, not because she was strict, which she was not particularly, or because she was easy, which she was not particularly either, but because she had a gift for identifying what a student actually needed to hear, which was almost never the same as what the student expected to be told. She could sit and listen to a student for 10 minutes and know, with a quiet certainty, where the truth was in their playing and where the performance was. She taught them to know the difference themselves. Her students went on to play in some of the finest orchestras in Europe. Several of them became significant performers in their own right. More than a few of them said, in later interviews, that what they had learned from her was not technique, though the technique was excellent, but something harder to name, a relationship to music, an understanding of what it was actually for. She never published the version of the waltz she had played that night at the Duke's. She played it from memory each time, and it was, by all accounts, never quite identical to how it had been the time before. Students and colleagues had attempted to transcribe it over the years, written out what they heard note by note and chord by chord. None of them felt they had captured it correctly. The transcriptions were all technically accurate, and all somehow missed the thing that made it what it was, which might be, she thought, the nature of things that are truly alive. They resist being captured. You can write down the notes. You cannot write down what makes them matter. There was an interview she gave, late in her life, to a young journalist who was writing an article about the history of music in Vienna. He was a serious young man, thorough and earnest, and he had done his research. He knew about the night at the Duke's house. He knew about Professor Gruber's diary entry. He knew about the standing ovations and the reviews and the students who had become distinguished performers. He asked her, toward the end of their conversation, whether she had been frightened that night, whether she had worried about what might happen if she played differently from what was expected, whether she had hesitated. She considered this for a moment. She looked out the window of the small parlor where they were sitting. The apartment was different now, but in the same neighborhood, always the same neighborhood, and she was quiet for long enough that he wondered if she had heard the question. Then she said, "I was not frightened of what they would think of the music. The music was going to be what it was regardless of what they thought." She paused. "I was frightened of something else. I was frightened of what I would think of myself if I played it the way they expected. If I walked into that room and made myself smaller so that no one would be uncomfortable." Another pause. That fear was real. That was a fear worth taking seriously. The journalist wrote down what she had said. Then he asked, "And what would you say to someone who is in that position now? Who has something real to offer but is being asked to offer something lesser?" She looked at him. She thought about the girl she had been at 22, walking home from the school on Warringer Strasse with the letter in her coat pocket. She thought about her father's. "Will you go for another reason as well?" She thought about the silence in the Duke's green-walled salon. She thought about Frau Lotte, on the afternoon she had first sat down at the old piano, pressing her hands against the edge of the bench with the earnest concentration of a child for whom something had just begun. "I would say," she said finally, "that the rooms that want to make you smaller are always going to be there. There will always be rooms that look at you when you walk in and have already decided what you are. The only thing you can do, the only thing that ever actually works, is to play something true enough that the room has to reconsider itself." She smiled a little, which was something she did not do often. "It does not always work," she said, "but it is the only thing worth trying." The night at the Duke's house became, in time, one of those small legendary moments that passed through Vienna's musical world by word of mouth. People who had been there told others who told others, and over the years the story gathered the slight glow that true stories sometimes gather when they are passed between people who recognize something real in them. The details shifted a little in the telling, as details do. The number of guests grew. The silence before the applause grew longer. The Duke's words at the piano became more elaborate, but the core of it stayed the same, because the core of it was simple enough to survive the retelling. A young woman who had been brought to a grand house to be background music, who had looked at the piano and decided to play it honestly, and who had left the room changed, Not changed in the way of someone who has had something done to them, but changed in the way of someone who has done something themselves, who has stepped fully into what they are, and found that it is enough. More than enough. The Duke lived for another 20 years after that evening. He funded the Vienna Philharmonic Society for much of that time, and he never missed a performance in which Elise was listed as a featured artist. He was not, by nature, a demonstrative man. He never again spoke to her of that first evening, except once, near the very end of his life, when they happened to be in the same room at a reception and she passed near him on her way to speak with someone else. He stopped her with a slight movement of his hand. "I have been meaning to tell you," he said, "for some time, what you played that evening, the first time you came to my house. I have heard a great deal of music in my life. That remains, in my memory, as one of the handful of moments when I understood what music is actually for." She looked at him. There was nothing theatrical about the moment. No orchestra swelling, no meaningful glances from across the room. Just two people in an ordinary corner of a crowded reception, and an old man saying something true. "Thank you," she said. He nodded once, in his brief and certain way, and moved on. She stood where she was for a moment. Then she went to find the person she had been going to speak with, and the evening continued, and the story continued, the way stories do, past the point where they can be neatly ended. But if you had to choose a moment, if you had to pick the point in the story at which everything that needed to be said had been said, that might be it. A simple waltz, played honestly, and the room reconsidered itself. A true real-life story, third-person narrative, one part, full script.